Hello, I'm David Gordon Koch, reporting for the NB Media Co-op. I'm joined today by Bruce Livesey, an award-winning reporter and investigative journalist whose writing has appeared in major publications such as the Globe and Mail, The Guardian, Toronto Star, and more. He has worked in broadcasting for shows such as CBC's The Fifth Estate and PBS Frontline, among others. In 2017, he won a National Newspaper Award for a series of stories on the Irving family published by the National Observer, and he has roots in New Brunswick, spending many of his formative years in Fredericton. Thanks for joining us today, Bruce.
My pleasure, David.
So, of course, we're talking today about the Irvings following the deaths of two of the family's patriarchs, James K. Irving, who was the owner of the JDI conglomerate, and Arthur Irving, who owned Irving Oil. They were worth 5.6 and 6.3 billion US dollars, respectively, at the time when they died, according to Forbes. One of the remarkable things I think to witness in the past few weeks, Bruce, has been the glowing tributes, notably the emphasis on philanthropy. For example, an editorial in the Telegraph Journal, which was owned by James K. Irving's company JDI until 2022, stated that in St. John especially, successes in reducing generational poverty have in large part owed to Mr. Irving's work. With respect to his monopoly on English language newspapers, the editorial said he brought the various newspapers in the province under one banner, and that over decades the family's involvement in the papers was overwhelmingly positive. So let's take these one at a time. What, in your estimation, is the effect of the Irving family on poverty in New Brunswick?
Well, I would argue they've made poverty worse. I mean, and the best way to answer that question is that in an economic reality where one family, one clan, one company or a set of companies dominates, that means you don't have competition. And when you don't have competition, you can really dictate wages, without much concern. And one of the realities of New Brunswick is the labor movement, and especially the organization by unions of the Irving interests, has never been particularly strong. And so in regards to getting better wages, it's not like you can walk across the door or it's not like you can walk across the street and get a job at a different oil refinery that would pay you better wages. It was like one oil refinery in St. John or one pulp and paper company. So as a monopoly or oligopoly, but mostly a monopoly, they could keep wages down. The second thing is they were particularly rapacious around taxes. So they didn't pay taxes, or paid as little taxes as they could. The father, Casey Irving, who died in 1992, he was famous for moving the control of the companies offshore to places like Bermuda, and so they were brilliant at evading taxes, and then they were fantastic at getting subsidies from taxpayers. So the New Brunswick taxpayers were paid vast sums of money to the Irvings through corporate subsidies. And then because of their tax evasion, because the Irving companies simply didn't pay much in taxes, that meant governments in both the municipal and provincial government in New Brunswick didn't have a lot of money to help the poor, to help, sustain, have reasonable rates of, say, welfare payments. It was the opposite. They exacerbated and help ensure that New Brunswickers were, I think, the second lowest average GDP in the entire country.
There's a lot of interesting stuff in your House of Irving series. One line here: are the Irvings the biggest corporate welfare bums in Canada? Was a question you asked. And it says here, the answer is simple. It's impossible to find out. That's because the Irving companies are all privately held, meaning that they don't have to reveal any financial information to the public. And further here, it says they also don't pay out dividends to shareholders. Only members of the Irving family presumably receive the wealth. So all of this leaves this kind of black box in New Brunswick with respect to what happens to their money. Not to mention this newspaper monopoly, which existed for years, which kind of
It
arguably really
existed from
inhibited.
like the 1940s, pretty much up until they sold them in, as you said, 2022. So pretty much 80 years of a newspaper monopoly.
And of course, you know, speaking of the charitable donations, all over New Brunswick, the Irving name is attached to various institutions. Most recently St. Thomas University in Fredericton. And full disclosure, I teach journalism courses for Stu. Announced new scholarship sponsored by Irving Oil and the Arthur L. Irving Family Foundation. Robert Irving, son of James K. Irving, sponsored a health center at the Moncton Hospital. We could go down the list, even looking to the United States, where at Dartmouth College, the Ivy League University in New Hampshire, there's a new center called the Arthur Irving Institute for Energy and Society. So, one might argue, and people often do, that through these measures, the Irvings have done their share to spread the wealth. So, how would you respond to that briefly?
Well, that's so two things. One, there's a very famous anecdote that when the University of New Brunswick was building their fabulous library, and they called it the Harriet Irving Library in the hopes that K.C. Irving, the patriarch, would give them a donation, and he did not, because K.C. Irving was notoriously cheap. So in regards to more recent donations, again, it's hard to know, like, without knowing specifics about the amounts and whether the amounts are announced or not. Like, but this, even if they gave a bit of money, this is a tiny fraction of their vast wealth that they earned at the expense of New Brunswickers. So it's sort of like, we're going to get, I'm going to take $100 from you, but I'm going to give you back 5 cents. And aren't I a fantastic guy? But I've taken $100 from you. Like, that's that. You got to remember, you got to put donations like this in the context of their overall wealth. And as you yourself just indicated, their combined wealth is close to 20 billion. Of these two brothers, was close to $20 billion Canadian. Okay. So they are not giving away $20 billion in charitable donations. And this is all window dressing in my mind.
Yeah, when you say window dressing, I mean, this brings up the argument. I think that a lot of people would say that these kind of donations serve an ideological function to sort of whitewash their reputation. And, you know, similar to their ownership of this newspaper monopoly for so many years, decades, which I think it's fair to say was one of the most controversial, if not the most controversial aspect of the family's holdings.
Well,
And again,
and two royal commissions on newspapers in this country condemned the Irving monopoly and the quality of those newspapers. So the notion that the Telegraph Journal, or writing laudatory things about James K. Irving's owning of the newspapers is just like, it's like these guys don't know how to read history. They don't know how to read Royal Commission reports. I mean, it's like they don't know. I mean, or let alone read the articles I wrote about their media monopoly, which showed how devastatingly awful they were.
and as you say, there, this grip on the province's newspapers and other media holdings has been studied by government, by royal commissions, also by scholars such as Aaron Stoiter of Mount Allison University, the subject of the book Irving versus Irving by CBC journalist Jacques Poitras, more recently the memoir Wires Crossed by Julian Walker, and of course you wrote about it for Canada's National Observer. So, can you elaborate a little bit on the consequences of the Irving newspaper monopoly for the province of New Brunswick?
Well, I would sort of, I guess there's sort of an analogy maybe with Fox News and Trump, right? So you where a portion of the population, it gets their news from a certain news outlet that has a particular bias, and that particular bias is not about informing people about what is in their best interest, but doing the exact opposite. And I would say the same thing existed with the New Brunswick newspapers owned by the Irvings for decades. And again, I speak from personal experience. I spent 2 summers working for the Fredericton Daily Gleaner back in the 1980s. So I saw how how these mechanisms worked, firsthand. And you could say that the function, it's like the movie The Matrix. It's like you're living in one reality. The media you're taking in is not telling you about that reality. They don't tell you about who owns everything. They don't tell you about the tax evasion or of the Irving clan. They don't talk about the environmental destruction they're responsible for. They're not, their thuggish and behavior, the methods they use to bully governments and on and on and on. They just didn't report any of that. And it's sort of, so the population is, if they read these newspapers or read them, and I'm sure it's not, quite frankly, any different with Post Media, which is a particularly, and I've written long features about Post Media, and it's a wretched newspaper chain. It's a right-wing, newspaper chain owned by hedge funds or private equity funds based out of New Jersey. The upshot is the citizens of New Brunswick are not learning about their own province from these media, and what they do get is really not in any way helping them understand the world they live in.
And for anyone in the audience who might not be aware, Post Media is the chain that purchased the newspapers from Brunswick News in 2022. And I also worked at Brunswick News newspaper at the height of the pandemic, and I can attest that that there was a sort of a separate process for articles that were critical that I wrote of Walmart, for example, and its labor practices, or the campaign to divest from fossil fuels at Mount Allison University. Those went through let's say a much more thorough and slow editorial process that resulted in watering them down. I mean, is there anything that you recall from your time?
Just to, one of the things that you're like, I think the one thing I would like to emphasize is that the newspapers did not cover the Irvings or their assets, really in any regard. When Kenneth Irving left Irving Oil, and he was the CEO of the company under extremely difficult circumstances, which we now know because he's been interviewed by the Globe and Mail about basically the mental health breakdown he had working for his father. None of that was reported in the Irving papers. Like, the easiest way to get fired in a newspaper working for the Irvings was to suggest you want to do some critical reporting on the Irvings. I mean, it's just, it wasn't going to happen. I mean, what I saw is, like, for example, I was working on a story one summer at the Fredericton Daily Gleaner about the spraying issue. They were still spraying, I think, DDT, like Agent Orange. They were using Agent Orange. Like, this is now early 1980s. They've already had the Vietnam War and all the controversies about Agent Orange. Well, of course, New Brunswick is still spraying Agent Orange on our forests. So I was doing a story about the regulation of pesticides in New Brunswick. And my editor, who was an idiot, said, yeah, go ahead. Like, he didn't ever really paid attention to any story ideas I had. So when they realized what I was up to, they killed that story. And I ended up doing it for a progressive magazine that was being published out of Nova Scotia called New Maritimes, which you may or may not remember, possibly long forgotten. So, that was, if you did, and well, why would they give a shit about spraying? Well, that's, of course, dealing with the interests of the forest interests of the Irvings, right? And they did not want it known to the citizens of New Brunswick that the forests of New Brunswick were being sprayed with Agent Orange at a time, years after Agent Orange had been exposed as this defoliant that led to hideous birth defects. So but yeah, they were happy to let me do stories critical of the provincial government's cuts to education and stuff like that. But anything to do with forestry and spraying and any forestry policy, no, 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 can't have that. And they would also cut out, if I remember doing a story where I interviewed some union people, like some CUPE folks, and they made me cut all those quotes out. Well, why? Well, you can't have unions. Even though ironically the Gleaner was a unionized newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
Unions are bad. And I remember covering the nursing home workers had gone on strike this particular summer, and I was going out writing stories about the strike while the editorial pages of the Gleaner were eviscerating the union and the workers for how dare you go on strike against against nursing homes. So no, there was these were some of the worst people I've ever met in the media, and I've met a lot of terrible people in the media.
Now, shifting gears to the Arthur Irving on the oil side of the family, the oil industrialist. He's remembered in one obituary published by the Telegraph Journal as an energetic man who shook hands with everyone he met. The political scientist Donald Savoy is quoted saying that Arthur Irving, he shied away from the media spotlight, and that's too bad because he was such an engaging person with a sharp wit and a keen sense of humor. What did you learn about Arthur Irving, the man, and his personality in your reporting in the House of Irving series, Bruce?
Well, everybody described him as extremely intense. He was very wired human being. And if you listen to interviews with him, he really comes off that way. Just this extraordinarily intense. The other is very mercurial and very angry. He was. I think he was the quintessential son of wealth, where it's like to the manner born attitude that whatever they think is obviously brilliant and whatever they want to do they should be able to do, and he would get very pissed off if he didn't get his way, and he was famous for berating people. He was vindictive. I interviewed his first wife, who he divorced in 1980, a very bitter divorce. He ordered his children after, and she was a super nice woman, by the way. He ordered his children not to have anything to do with their mother after the divorce. He alienated 3 of his 4 children, at least, from his first marriage, most famously Kenneth, who I've mentioned. But even he had another son whose name I can't remember, but he even drove him out of the company. So no, he remarried. He had another daughter. I don't know about their relationship, but I find it interesting that I think they're trying to sell Irving oil. But he also drove his executives rather mad. He went through a bunch of executives, one of whom sued him for $50 million and complained about the interference by Arthur. And again,
this was after the falling out with his son Kenneth.
Yeah, this was after after he kicks Kenneth out, and there's a story I was told. Kenneth ends up at some point in a it's a clinic in Boston to deal with his mental health crisis. Basically, and the story I heard was Arthur showed up one day with his lawyers in tow and demanded that Kenneth leave this clinic. And the doctors told him to piss off, and Kenneth was left alone. But that's the sort of guy he was. The lawsuit I mentioned was so after Kenneth left, a guy called Mike Ashar, who I think he came from Suncor. Anyway, he came from one of the big Alberta oil company. He came in. He sued them. I got a copy of that lawsuit. It's not pretty reading. And I later on interviewed Mike. Again, very nice guy, very low key guy. So like Arthur would alienate even the mildest of human beings. And eventually he kind of went through all these executives and ended up with his accountant from Deloitte being the CEO of Irving Oil, because I don't think anybody could tolerate working with him. So yeah, he was known as a bully and thin-skinned and vindictive.
And so, all the same, we've been seeing tributes to Arthur Irving, along with his brother James K. Irving, coming from several quarters. Not surprisingly, Premier Blaine Higgs, who was a longtime Irving Oil executive, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
I was going to say also, Arthur didn't get along with James. That was another thing I forgot to mention, that in the split among the brothers, the most bitter split was between James and Arthur. So, and then the cousins couldn't get along, like the Arthur's kids and James's kids could, because originally in the 90s, the brothers wanted their sons to kind of work in concert to see if they could eventually, collect, like they had collectively take over, and they couldn't get along.
So, for better or for worse, there seems to be a tendency, at least in Canada, or at least in the English Canadian press, to celebrate and honor powerful and well-known figures when they die, even if they were deeply controversial or disliked in some quarters in life. And so I'm thinking, for example, the death of Jim Flaherty, who was longtime finance minister for Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and to my mind, rather lionized in the mainstream media following his death in 2014. Even though one might argue he was, during his time in office, this sort of doctrinaire bean counter who only budged from a basically fiscal hawk position, when he was faced with a world historical financial crisis. So people will say, don't speak ill of the dead, even if they're responsible for all kinds of hardship for ordinary people. And I guess what surprises me are the tributes for the Irvings coming from people like New Brunswick Senator Nancy Hartley. This is someone with a long background in progressive causes like ending poverty and domestic violence in Moncton, and yet in her senator's newsletter, she included a tribute to James K. Irving, calling him one of New Brunswick's great builders. So, not to ask you to account for, the remarks of an individual senator, but what do you make of this kind of lionization of people who are arguably some of, in the case of the Irvings, arguably some of Canada's most rapacious business people?
Well, look, if you want to get Marxist about this, we live in a capitalist society. These are capitalists. These are, if you live in a capitalist society, these are the people you want to be. You want to be capitalist, and the role of the state in a capitalist society is to aid and abet the capitalists. So it's not shocking that politicians who have spent their careers aiding and abetting the likes of Arthur and James K. Irving they're not going to say, oh, by the way, I didn't, he was a bastard all along. No, they're going to say, no, these are fantastic people, because, they, in many ways, and, in one of the stories I wrote for The Observer, which you mentioned, which was about whether or not the Irvings were Canada's biggest corporate welfare bums, one of the things I discovered was just the vast amount of money, subsidies, tax breaks that the Irvings were receiving. Well, who's giving them to? Well, it's these state agencies who are bending over backwards, especially in New Brunswick. I mean, it's shot that you could spend a lifetime, David, writing about how state agencies in New Brunswick give the Irvings whatever the fuck they want, because that's what they do. And so is it a surprise that the people who are at the top of the pyramid of these state agencies then say nice things about all the money and subsidies and tax breaks they've been giving them? Of course not. They're going to say nice things, So no, that doesn't surprise me. I think the other thing is you got to remember that, the sort of articles I did and, the other occasional bit of critical reporting, like, Bob Jones and the odd CBC journalist does, those are kind of pebbles in the ocean compared to the years of either lionizing these guys. You've got to remember, for example, in the middle of my reporting for the Observer, when Irving Oil knew I was doing a piece on Irving Oil, and this was Arthur Irving was famous for not giving interviews, and of course they would never deign to be interviewed by me. Suddenly, the Financial Post flies in a reporter from the oil patch from like Edmonton or Calgary, and to do, a flattering corporate profile of Arthur Irving. Well, why were they doing that story that particular time? And it's because they knew I was coming out with a story that was going to be critical of them, and so why did they go to the Financial Post? Because they knew the Financial Post would be kind to them, and they were. And why that reporter? Well, because that reporter has a history of reporting uncritically of the oil patch. And then later on, in fact, that reporter went off to work for Jason Kenney's greenwashing operation that he set up when he became Premier of Alberta to attack the environmental movement. So, it's
The
like
Energy War Room, I believe it was called.
So this is, like guys like me and the other odd reporter who wrote critically of them. We were extraordinarily rare. So what was got so in the case of the Irvings, it wasn't so much what the reporting was about. It was the fact there was a lack of reporting. There was just almost no reporting about them. There was no reporting, obviously, done by their own newspapers. The Toronto media was too far away and didn't give a shit about them, And then you had the CBC outlets in places like Fredericton and St. John, and that's another whole story. But I mean, there was, Bob Jones at CBC has done wonderful reporting, So but that's small potatoes given, their own propaganda, because they had a very sophisticated public relations apparatus, very aggressive. They would attack the journalists. They would attack the CBC, and their message was always, Irving's good for New Brunswick, and people bought it. People bought the bullshit.
So now we've seen some rather surprising changes at the Irving Empire in the past couple of years. First, the JDI selling off the Brunswick newspaper chain to Post Media, and more recently the statement from Irving Oil last June, that it's engaged in a strategic review that it says may involve a full or partial sale of the company, which of course controls Canada's largest oil refinery. Now with the deaths of, I suppose, the two most senior patriarchs of the family, what's your take? Are we seeing the New Brunswick version of the HBO series Succession, or what do you think might be in store for the province of New Brunswick yet, Bruce?
So again, the empire, as I mentioned earlier, was split into three components in 2009. The most significant are Irving Oil and J.D. Irving. And J.D. Irving's really heavily focused on things like the pulp and paper industry, but also shipbuilding. In terms of who is going to run things on the Irving Oil side, this is the problem, because Arthur chased away his sons from his first marriage. So Kenneth would have been the logical person to have taken over when he passed away. And then he had one daughter, I think her name is Sarah, from his second marriage. And if they're considering selling it, I'm not shocked that she doesn't want to run the company. Like I don't know anything about her, and I've never heard anything about her. But it just doesn't surprise me that by herself she would want to run this company. It's why not sell it and spend the rest of your life living off the proceeds? So I would imagine with Irving Oil that in a few years it'll no longer be Irving Oil. It'll be some subsidiary of like Exxon or Esso or something. Mm-hmm. With J.D. Irving, the two sons, James K. Irving's two sons, they are capable managers. they do have what the capacity to continue to run that empire. But they're also not young men anymore. I mean, you remember the father died, he was well into his 90s, so the sons are well up there too. And their children, I've heard nothing significant. I know about one of the sons who ran the newspapers, and no one spoke highly of him as a businessman. So you might also see on the J.D. Irving side in a few years, that empire might be broken up too. But of the two divisions, or those two main divisions, I think I would imagine Irving Oil is eventually going to go as an Irving owned enterprise, and it wouldn't surprise me in a couple of decades if that's true of J.D. Irving as well.
It's fascinating stuff, and it seems to me, when we talk about the hyper wealthy in this day and age, it's sometimes pointed out that they probably have the biggest carbon footprint towards climate change. We're living in an age of inequality. These issues are coming to the fore increasingly. It seems to me that people often overlook that the Irvings are not the only family of powerful billionaires in New Brunswick, because there's also the McCain dynasty of Florenceville and their frozen food empire. And just thinking before we wrap up, Bruce, can you talk briefly about any tips you might have, or some of the challenges that you ran into in terms of, as an investigative reporting on such powerful private interests, as you did for the House of Irving series for the National Observer?
Well, I think if a rich man or their enterprises have a history of aggression, meaning they will go after journalists, they will sue. I just spent 5 years engaged in litigation because of two stories I wrote back in 2018 against a private fund manager here in Toronto, who is notoriously litigious and notoriously aggressive. He hires the worst private investigation firms in the world. He hired a very famous Israeli private investigation firm to go after me and many other people, including a judge.
Was that Black Cube?
Yeah, he hired Black Cube. And the Irvings were all of that ilk, very aggressive. They hired top Bay Street lawyers, including one who had a history of working for the media, and who's now a judge. To intimidate us. We would get letters from this guy, like I think he worked at Blake's, which is one of the top 7 corporate law firms in the country, being very threatening us. Although, it was theater of the absurd. But J.D. Irving had a private investigation firm. Not that they sicked it on us, but we don't know. We know they used it for other intimidation purposes. So the upshot is that the Irvings would go after academics who had tenure. And I remember talking to an academic at your university at St. Thomas who refused to talk to me because she was too afraid. Fortunately, there were other academics who were braver and would talk, but so that when they have political power, economic power, they control the media, and they have powerful lawyers at their beck and call. Guess what? People don't want to talk to you. They don't want to, and that was the challenge of getting people to talk to me.
Well, maybe all the more reason that people should support independent journalism, like at the NB Media Co-op and the National Observer and other independent news media across the country. Before we wrap up, Bruce.
Well, just Serge, on that note,
sure.
The National Observer really has to be given tremendous kudos, because I don't think there was any other media outlet that would have allowed me the amount of space and time to focus on the Irvings. Like it wasn't going to happen with the CBC and wasn't going to happen with any other of the big media outlets. So the Observer has to be given, you know, tremendous credit for that.
Mm. Well, is there anything else you want to mention? Any projects that you're working on that you can tell us about today, Bruce, or anything you want to plug?
Well, bizarrely, I've been doing. I'm working with another alternative media outlet in Montreal called The Breach on the foreign interference story, which I wrote a big feature for them on why this was a concoction of the mainstream media, and we're doing a follow-up story on that. So yeah, that's. And then I do pieces for CBC Radio's Ideas, so I'm currently working on a piece for them that'll come out in the fall.
Well, we'll be interested to see what you come up with. The Breach, of course, is a friend of the NB Media Co-op. We're on unrigged.ca, as well as The Breach and a number of other great news and commentary sources across the country. So I guess we'll leave it at that for now. Thanks so much for joining us. I've been speaking to award-winning reporter and investigative journalist Bruce Livesey. Thanks for speaking to me today, Bruce.
No worries. Thanks, David.